All right, welcome back to my YouTube channel, Wonders and Miracles, where we get to celebrate miraculous moments in everyday lives. My name is Liza Lawrence, and I'm so happy to have you join me today as we talk with Kari and Mike from Wisconsin about the time in January 2021 when Mike contracted COVID. He was a healthy guy, no underlying conditions, but his health took a turn for the worst in some pretty drastic ways. I'll just mention a few. He had got pneumonia, heart failure, kidney failure, blood clots. He was in a coma. So some pretty drastic things that they're going to share with us and the miracles that they saw. But before we jump into that, if you love miracle stories and want to hear more, hit the like and subscribe button so you can catch all the inspiring and uplifting episodes of real people sharing real miracles. So, Kari and Mike, thank you so much for being on the show. I'm excited to hear the details of this story, and go ahead and tell us what happened.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for wanting to talk with us. I guess our story starts back in January of 2021. You know, we were kind of still trying to ride out COVID. You know, there was still the vaccine coming, but it wasn't available yet. And we have a son who has special needs, and he got COVID. And we tried to quarantine him, and it was just impossible to do that. And we all ended up getting it. I actually got pretty sick, and we were kind of concerned about me. And then I was getting better, and then Mike was getting sick and just not getting better.
As Kari said, our son, who is an adult, but he's kind of like a 6 or 7 year old. So it's very hard to get him to follow any kind of restrictive regimen. We couldn't quarantine him, and we ended up getting sick. And then during that time, I started getting sick. We're lucky enough in our church, we have some members of our church who are doctors, physicians, other in the medical field. So we were able to get some good advice. And they actually came over to our house, and they suggested that we get a pulse oximeter so that we could check my pulse oxygen. And I was doing that. And they said, well, if it gets below 90, then you should go to the hospital. That was good advice. We felt comfortable. And I think pretty quickly within the next day or two, I still was having trouble breathing. It was dipping down to 89. And so we talked to another nurse friend to get even a third opinion. And she said, yeah, you should really go to the hospital. And she suggested that we go to the medical hospital. It's kind of a teaching hospital, Freighter. It's in southeastern Wisconsin. It's a great hospital.
So yeah, so I actually dropped him off thinking, okay, he just needs some supplemental oxygen. Yeah. I couldn't go in.
Right, she couldn't go in, hospitals
so I really
are very
thought
restricted.
It would be like I'd drop him off and I'd be back in an hour or 2 hours. He just need a little assistance with some oxygen and maybe some steroids. But honestly, they took an x-ray and admitted him right away. Within hours, he ended up in the ICU. So it went from me thinking I was dropping him off to get some supplemental oxygen to him calling me in a panic, like, Kari, like they're putting me in the ICU. And I was like, what? I couldn't believe it. And they really tried for a while, like days, they tried. And then every x-ray they would do, it came back worse, and it was already bad. And then it got to the point where they were saying, his lungs are just flooded, like it's like a whiteout. So he got there and they gave him this like nuclear antibodies right away, because they said the reason he was as bad as he was is for some reason his body didn't make the antibodies for it. So why, we have no idea, because he's a totally healthy guy. I think even they say like O positive is supposed to be the most resistant to it, and that was his blood type.
Wow.
So they were really like very baffled, but they're like, he'll get these antibodies and it should turn around within 48 hours. So we were like very encouraged, because I was really scared. Him in the ICU, the kids and I couldn't. So we have 4 kids as well, and we couldn't see him. It was scary. And then we were really lucky to have a couple of friends who work there. As his x-rays were getting worse and worse, they were starting to say like the ventilator's not going to be enough. Like there's nowhere to go. And, all we had heard up until this point was like, you go on a ventilator and there's a big chance you're not coming off it.
Yeah. The news at that time was saying that people going on a ventilator had a less than a 40% chance of surviving, that was kind of a death sentence if you went onto a ventilator. So when they started talking about ventilator, I remember just immediately thinking that I might not make it. I had to seriously consider that I was going to die. And I remember laying on my stomach with my head propped up with an opening so that I could see down. And I remember FaceTiming with my phone laying on the bed beneath my face. They were saying that they were going to put me on a ventilator, that I would be unconscious, and they didn't know how long it would be. And I remember talking to the family. We were crying, and we own a business, and I take care of all of the finances, and everything is in my head. And so I remember telling her all the important passwords, trying to tell her the key things that they would need and who that they could contact to help them navigate their way through, and who to sell the company to. All of these things that I was trying to think, if these are the last things that I can do, how can I best care for my family with things that will help them financially? Because we have a very strong family. We know that we love each other. We're very spiritual. I just wanted to make sure that they were going to be okay tomorrow and the next day and the next day, and that they wouldn't have to worry about the finances.
To back up just a little bit though, just two stories that lead up to that. So while Mike was in the ICU and we were still trying to figure things out, a very close friend of ours, he's a member of our church, he goes on walks every single morning. And as he walks, he always asks God for him to put someone on his heart that he needs to pray for. Mike's name immediately came to him, and he hadn't seen Mike in a while. We had been just doing virtual church. There was nothing that led him to know any of this was going on yet. He picked up the phone and called him, and I don't think he was really able to talk to him. And then he called me, and without even knowing, I'm like, yeah, this is really bad, and he just was like, had no idea, and it was so neat already that God had put him on his heart. He was one of the people that said, even before all of this had started, that he said that Mike's spirit would eventually teach his body to heal itself, which was really interesting, because I was like, what does that mean? Like, heal itself? Like, how bad is this going to get, And a very dear friend of ours called me and actually worked in the ICU, and they talked about ECMO, so them saying, okay, the ventilator is not enough. It was like very scary, because it's like, what is there after, a ventilator? And they start talking to me about ECMO, which what ECMO does is that he had these two huge cannulas that kind of were put into his neck, in his carotid artery. And then it takes one tube, takes the blood. So half of the blood in his body was outside of his body at one time. So it takes the blood out of his body, puts it in a machine, adds oxygen, and then it puts it back in his body. So it's basically keeping him alive by giving him oxygen that he wouldn't have been able to get in any other way. But then there's a lot of complications that can come with it too. I mean, it's really scary, and I'm kind of happy. I'm so grateful for it, but I'm also happy I didn't know the full details, because they say that it's not like you go on it and it's like, okay, this is for sure, it's a small chance. So to have our friend call me and say, this is why he needs ECMO, he's a perfect candidate for it, like, this is our last chance. And his best chances of having success with it are if he goes on it within the 14-day period. The next day was going to be 14 days. So it was really like now or never if we want to do it, and if we want to have the best possible outcome from this. And then the anesthesiologist that was in the room with him was a very dear friend of ours from church as well. And it was just a complete coincidence that he was the one there with my kids and I, saying, I'm going to take your husband down and I'm going to give him a blessing, which we do a lot in our church. We give blessings.
By the laying on of hands by a member of the church who holds the priesthood, and in the name of Jesus Christ, we give a blessing. And through that, the power of healing, we can give a healing blessing and receive a healing blessing. One of the miracles that we experienced over and over again, it is the Lord putting a person in your path. He blesses us by either giving us direction of a person that needs help, or putting people in our path that can specifically help us. And we saw that over and over again. I mean, the odds of thousands of doctors in this huge hospital, and we have the two main doctors that are treating us right in the beginning are members of our own congregation.
Yeah. So it was really scary, for when they were taking him down to put him on ECMO, they said there's a chance, he could just be okay.
Right. They kind of thought, we'll put him on this for a couple of days.
He said some people
48
are on
hours.
this for a couple of days, some people a couple of weeks. But I think at the very most, it would be a couple of weeks. It shouldn't be long.
And we later found out that when you talk about life support, there's nothing more that they can do to support your life than ECMO. There's nothing That's the last line of things that they can try to keep you alive.
But
Just how new this is, I think Frederick was the only hospital in Wisconsin, and Frederick had 1, 2, 3 ECMO machines, and they were just finished being trained on them. I was one of the very first people, I think, one of the first.
This was the only hospital that was doing this. The fact that he was already here, because they're like people on waiting lists. So they put him on ECMO. He went into surgery, and we thought, okay, we didn't know if we were going to be able to talk to him, if he was going to be awake. And at first he was awake right away. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing, because we were so afraid. But he ended up being put into a coma. The ECMO was doing what it needed to do, but there was just so much damage to his lungs at that point. So they put him into a coma because everything else was kind of going really unstable as well. He started to go into heart failure. So they called me, and what they needed to do was attach the ECMO to his heart now. So it was going to beat his heart for him. And then he started to go into liver failure and kidney failure. And at this time, it was just really scary because I was just here with the kids. Normally, we're pretty private people. But I was like, I just know I need everybody praying as much as I can right now. And so I started to kind of get the word out there. It was just incredible, though, the way that our church and our community and our schools,
our family, we have a large extended family. People
just stepped in and helped us and just prayed and prayed and prayed. To not go into too much detail, we have a son with special needs. He's now 23. And when he was born, he had a lot of problems. He was born with a syndrome that caused significant birth defects. And obviously that was 23 years ago. But I went to a place where I was angry at God. I was angry at him. I didn't want to turn to him. I just wanted to be angry. And it took me to a really, really dark place. I was really just completely hopeless. And so after getting to a low, I was like, I have to let God carry me through this because I'm not going to make it. And it was a moment where we really just knelt down and I gave it over to him. And I remember that so strongly because as we started to go through what was another huge trial in my life, I was like, there's no way I'm going to get through this with this time. I've got to just turn to him immediately. And so I remember sitting my kids down and saying to them, I know this is really scary. I'm scared. I don't know what direction this is going to take, but I don't want you to look at this like, why is this bad thing happening to us? I want you to look at this and say, this is our opportunity. This is our opportunity to show our faith. This is our opportunity to trust, let others help us. And I said, it's just an opportunity for a lot of things right now. And if you can look at it that way, you're going to see this so differently than if you just sit and say, why is this happening to us? Why? It was really amazing because the kids really embraced that. There was one particular story in the Bible that we really used. I was doing something with the kids one day and we were reading about the wall of Jericho and when they marched around the wall and God just told them to keep marching, and they didn't question it. Every day they could have been like, why are we doing this? Because nothing fell, not a brick, nothing. Yet they were faithful and they obeyed and they kept walking. And then nothing, day 5, day 6, and then day 7. Not just a brick fell, but the whole wall. And so it was interesting because I would tell the kids after we studied that, I said, you guys, we keep walking and our day 7 will come. And it sort of became a thing where someone would get really sad or distraught and we'd be like, day 7. And
I love that.
Came our thing, day 7, you keep walking, our day 7 is coming. So this got really scary. Mike was in a coma and I finally was able to get to the hospital after he was there. No one else was allowed to go yet. So it was really scary. I walked into a room where the first time I got to see him, this guy, like he's my everything. We just celebrated our 27th wedding anniversary. Like we're just a team, that's how we work.
We're a really good team. We depend on each other for very specific things. We really fit well together with how we manage our family. And when one of us is missing, it's a big deal. It's not like the other one can just step up and do it, but that's exactly what Kari did. She's amazing. Amazing.
Well, I did it with a lot of support, a lot of miracles of people who just stepped in and helped me. And so my dear friend Becky is a nurse there in the ICU, and not in Mike's ICU, but she was able to come in there to see him or see me, because otherwise I was just there all by myself.
With machines.
And while this is all going on, my son, just couldn't understand or grasp the concept. Your dad's in a coma. You can't talk to him. You can't see him. You can't, that what was so hard is the kids couldn't even see him. So we made these big poster boards and pictures and put things in his rooms. So I would sit by his side. I'd play his favorite songs, and I'd hope to just be there if he was going to wake up a little or open his eyes. And sometimes they would try, and the terror, everything would drop so drastically that they'd immediately have to put him back in.
So how many weeks was this that I was in a coma at this point?
Maybe 2 weeks.
So all this had happened in 2 weeks. Heart failure, kidney failure, liver failure.
So what happened is I want to say they said he got like 15 different types of pneumonia on top of COVID. So what would happen is his body, so one day I was on my way to the hospital. At this point, they were letting one more visitor come. So we have a daughter that's 23 at this time. We could have one more visitor, but you could not change him out and we could not be there at the same time. One day I was on my way there and the nurse called me. She just was like, "Are you here?" And I said, I'm pulling in right now. And she's like, "Okay, well, we just need you to get up here." And I was like, what's going on? And she's like, "We'll explain it. Just go in right away. They'll bring you up, And I went in and I got up into the ICU, and there was people just waiting there for me, which I knew was bad, And then you hear like these code blues going off, and they lead me in there, and they're just talking to me as I'm going in there. And so they start explaining that basically the COVID had just leaked out of his lungs into his bloodstream, and he had gone septic. It was like, one of the highest numbers they said they've ever seen of his white blood cell count. And like he was coding, and they were trying to save him basically.
I remember you telling me that when they told you that, in your mind, you were thinking, this is what you told me, if you just get me to him, he'll be okay. Just get me to him. If he can hear my voice, he'll
if he can feel me next to him, it's going to be okay. And so I got there, and they're all just kind of working and doing all these things. And somebody went and got Asen, and they made an exception for her to get there because they didn't think he was going to make it. And so then I was like, "Well, can my other kids get here?" And they're like, "We're so sorry. No, they can't. They're not 18. And we're only, and I'm just, I didn't think about the time, but like you think now, like this was happening all the time where people were
losing
their
mothers,
loved
their
ones,
fathers, their family members, and not able to say goodbye.
I was thinking like my kids, they might not get to say goodbye to their dad. Really? Like, as I reflected on that, it's like, oh my gosh, for all these people that had to go through that, just breaks your heart. So I was leaning into Mike's ear. I kept saying over and over, "The Lord will fight for you. You need to only be still." And I just kept repeating it in his ear. And then I'd say, "I'm right here. I'm right by your side." And I had the strongest impression that I needed to tell people to pray. I grabbed my phone. I just sent out, "Please pray," and just send it. And people just started sending it and sending it and sending it and sending it and sending it. And even when things were still really scary, I was standing there and you could feel it in the room. You could feel the spirit so strong in that room. And I felt, even as I was telling Mike, like, "I'm here, the Lord is fighting for you." I could feel the power of prayer. I could just feel it surrounding us. And it was really interesting because one of the nurses, I remember he was working on one of the other machines, turned to me and he said, "It's okay. It's going to be okay." And I looked at him and I was like, "But how do you know that? You don't know that." And he just said, "It just is." But it was just like so significant, and they were able to get him stable enough that they were like, "We're taking this hour by hour right now." They were able to get his heart going again. But at the same time, like, he's fighting against so many elements right now. So I remember we went into this break room And my daughter was just kind of crying and kind of crumbling in a ball. And I was like, we're not giving up, Aislinn. We're not giving up. He's in there fighting. He's in there and I'm here, but we're still doing this together. You know, we're still fighting in this battle. We're not giving up. God's not giving up. I can feel it. I know there's a ton of people out there that are not giving up. And people were so genuinely concerned because they, you know, or they want to know what specifically to pray for, you know, and now it's like, okay, well, it's not just COVID. It's not just ECMO. It's not just a ventilator. It's kidney failure. It's liver failure and it's heart failure. So there's a lot, you know. During this time, I was coming home at night and it was challenging because my son just didn't understand. And I think I was the safe person. So he kind of took it out on me.
So before I went in the hospital, he was beginning to have some aggression. He's like a 6-year-old in now a 23-year-old's body. So it's very hard when a 23-year-old throws a 6-year-old tantrum. With me being gone, he wasn't able to figure out in his head what's going on with Dad. Why isn't he here? And then when other things would happen to get him upset, he got very aggressive with Kari and Aislinn and to a point to where Kari told me that neighbors had to come and help to restrain Brendan. And
yeah, it turned into a situation where he's a sweet boy. He just didn't know how to process it, but he was attacking me. So to be sitting by your husband while he's in a coma, fighting for his life, and then come home and get attacked by your son to the point where you're not safe and your children are terrified. It was really hard. I was really scared and I was really leaning on God because I was like, I can't do this, you know, I'm scared. And sometimes at night I would go to bed just exhausted, even filled with despair sometimes, but I would tell myself, I'll get up, I'll read my scripture, and I will get what I need to get through that day. And God did it all the time for me, over and over. He would really just find a way to give me the strength to do what I needed to do that day. And I would walk every day when I get to the hospital. There was a lot of walking and waiting because I'd have to go through checkpoints. As I'd walk down the hallway, I would just ask God to give me the strength so that I could give it to Mike. And I would say it in my head over and over. And literally I could feel something just flip as I'd walk into that hospital room. And it was like, I got this. You know, I was the one that Mike always kind of was like, he's my everything. And he's always saying, I got you. You know, well, this time I was like, I got you. For me, that's a big deal because I'm someone who struggles with confidence. I'm someone who struggles with feeling like I can do things, like I'm enough. I get anxious. And so for me to find that courage and strength to be brave enough to feel like I've got this, you know, was
Miracle.
people, yeah.
Definitely a miracle, divine help.
And people had asked me, they're like, where did you get that? Like, where? And I was like, it's just God. It's just God. There's nothing else I can tell you except that it's all God. And so the next issue that kind of came up with Mike was we would find a pneumonia, they would find a specific strain, and they would target it and then switch those antibiotics. And we just kept trying to get his white blood count down because it was so insanely high. And so for a while, it was like, we're not taking him out of a coma. They were doing dialysis, trying to get fluid off because he had so much fluid on him from trying to keep him alive that you could like touch him and it would just indent. I can remember at one point, his eyes were so puffed up out of his face that they had to put goggles on him because his eyelids couldn't close and they were drying out and, you know, getting a chance of getting infected. And then on top of all this, they're trying to watch his brain activity because he had to be on blood thinners because the longer you're on ECMO, the more you have a chance of just having a blood clot that just goes in your brain or you get a stroke. So every day longer he's on ECMO, every day the percentage is going up. It's higher and higher that he could just have a stroke. So they found a blood clot in his leg, which is another side effect of COVID. But they were trying to just target these infections because the pneumonias would just keep coming. And then his lungs collapsed. His left lung collapsed, his right lung collapsed. So they had tubes in both of his chests draining them. But it would be like something else would happen that it would set him back. So he got this blood clot in his leg and they were kind of watching it. they could tell he was in a lot of pain. And so they went and took a CT scan of it, and it was something called compartment syndrome. So basically the blood flow was completely cut off, and they just rushed him into surgery, and they just had to open up his whole leg and start cutting out dead muscle and leaving his leg open. And then they would pack it. And then the next day they'd take him back in and cut out more as it died. And they just kept saying, we're just hoping we can save some of this. He came back in from surgery. All of a sudden, he just started bleeding out all over the place. Everything started dropping, his heart rate, his blood pressure. Like, they just started doing surgery on him right there, trying to clot it off, trying to figure out why he's bleeding out all over the place, trying to get his blood pressure, his heart rate back up again, trying to save him. The longer Mike's on ECMO is not meant to be long-term like that. And he ended up being on it for 3.5 months. The oxygenator in the machine, it's not meant to run that long on people, and it would clog and have to be changed out. When they would have to do that, they would have to stop it and do CPR on him to keep him alive. There were times that in the middle of the night, they would just have to start doing this. And then one time, one of the doctors from church actually gave his testimony about the timing of God can be so perfect. For some reason, in this machine, which they've never seen happen before, an air bubble caught in the tube. So if this air goes into his brain, he has a stroke. So they have one person that kind of just watches the ECMO machines on the ICU unit. And
he had 5 of them.
He goes all around that area. And he happened to be in the room.
With his hands on the machine when that happened. And if he hadn't been right there when that happened, it happens that quick. That would have been it.
The whole machine is down, and they just start performing CPR on him. And they had to restart and get a whole new machine in there. They didn't know why this got an air bubble. This just, the doctor that checks on him for the ECMO his room was there and the desk was here, and he happened to be standing at the desk right there. So it was just such a miracle that the tech was in the room right there with the machine when this happened, and that there was not seconds delayed, that someone could get in there and start CPR as quickly as they did in order to save his life. And then there was this thing of, are you in there, Mike? If you do come out of this, and I believe you are, but are you still going to be Mike? I would just trust that whatever was going to happen anyway. And God had known it all, and he knows it all. And so I'm just going to trust him with whatever's going to be coming my way with him. But of course, I want him to still be my guy. I lost my dad a year before this happened. There were 2 men in this world that made me feel so safe. And they were my dad and Mike. And I didn't have either of them. I mean, Mike was still here, but he wasn't able to talk to me or tell me. And my dad, I just want to hear his voice so bad. And I was sitting next to Mike in his bed, and it was the year anniversary of my dad passing away. And I remember saying, like, Dad, I can't do this. Mike, I need you to tell me it's going to be okay. I need to hear your voice. I'm so scared. And why aren't you here? Why aren't you here? And I just felt like a rush come over me. And I knew that my dad was fighting for him on the other side. I didn't have a doubt. And there was such a peace that came with that. And it was a really cool moment I had in that room. I was all by myself. So we get through one hurdle, and we were kind of told that too, but Mike really just hit every single thing he could, that it was kind of called the COVID coaster. There was a point when they kept slowly being able to bring him out more and more as he improved. He couldn't move anything. So when Mike finally was up and awake, he couldn't even move his own head. He couldn't move his hand. Like, if his hand fell or his foot fell off the bed, he couldn't bring them back up himself. He was now getting like bruises. The skin was tearing off his face from all the monitors. And so he had a trach in, because after being on the vent for so long, they're like, it's a high risk of infection, and we think it might help with a little of the panic if we put a trach in. So he had a trach in, so he couldn't speak. He could only mouth things to me.
So that was another miracle right there. As Kari said, I wasn't able to speak. I couldn't even whisper. So I would try and talk and mouth things, and no one could understand me. Nobody. Doctors, nurses, they would, what do you need? He'd write it down. I couldn't hold a pen. I could barely even point at things. Kari would walk in the room, and even from across the room, I could mouth anything, and she could understand it, every word, every time. It was like a miracle. It's almost like he had practiced and had been expert at it prior to this, because she just understood everything that I was saying. That miracle extended to my daughter Aislinn as well. She could understand everything that I would say. When I would mouth things, it was like we were just talking normal. It was so comforting to me to be able to communicate, because it can be very frustrating not being able to say the simplest things or ask questions or to find things out. When Kari mentioned that I was so weak that I couldn't lift my limbs, I couldn't do really anything, it reminds me of one of my first waking moments, waking up in the middle of the night. The nurse button was nowhere to be found. It wasn't in my hand, and I was struggling to breathe, fighting against the ventilator. I remember feeling so panicky and just prayerfully begging the Lord for comfort, and immediately being calm, and immediately beginning to get in rhythm with the ventilator and breathing with the ventilator, and understanding that it was breathing for me, and to let it just do its job, and that I was fine, being able to think rationally. And I can't explain the feeling, but it was as if my prayer wasn't alone. It was as if there was a group, a multitude of people that, because of their prayers, was giving me this greater access to the blessing. And it gave me peace, and I was able to stay calm and wait for the nurse to come back. And it was just, anyone who has struggled and felt like they were drowning, metaphorically or realistically, and reached out to the Lord and had that answer, it's the only way that you can describe. It's a feeling that you can't describe. It's just, you have to have had that feeling of despair, and that there's nothing that you can do except to get help. And then that help comes from God, and it changes you, and it gives you that peace. It was so welcome, and it was so real. It was thanks to all of those people who were praying for us.
After Mike started to seem a little more himself, which I remember I was so reassured when I could see that that was my guy. He's still in there. That's him. It was a corner, like we had turned a corner, and the PTs would come in every day, and they just would try to have him do anything they could. And first it was like all of them holding him up, and his head would wobble and he couldn't hold anything up on his own. But it was so important to have him sit up just to keep his lungs, to keep things moving, because it was like, we've got to get him off this ECMO. It's great, it's kept him alive, but it's also causing a lot of problems now. They had a conversation, and I could see that they were getting very nervous the longer he was on this, and that we needed to get him off of it as quickly as possible, because now we were starting to have a lot more complications. So the day they decided to take him off of it, we had gotten to the lowest setting, which was huge in itself. And it was just so cool, because they came in and they let me stay in the room while the surgeon came in and took it out and everything. And there was like, you could see some of the doctors, the respiratory therapists, they were like all just peeking in the window, because we're all just kind of on pins and needles, like, how's this going to go? But it was such a cool feeling too, to see them get him off of that. And then he went off of the vent. They wheeled that machine out, and it was just like, everybody was so excited. People were stopping in. For a lot of these people there, this in itself is a miracle, because they need these wins, not just for me because it's my husband and the father of my children and my best friend, but just see them losing people after people. And then the ones that they save, when they've gotten as critically ill, like Mike, and so many times almost died, it was like healing for them too. It was just really cool, because we all really celebrated it together. But it was also another step of Mike having to relearn to breathe on his own. And that was really hard for him.
It was the beginning of the path that I'm still on now, is the path of recovery. It's been just over a year since I came home, and I'm still in need of a kidney. My kidney function's at 13%. My lungs are at 65% or 63%.
So when we went to see his pulmonologist after he got out of the hospital, I remember the first time we went there and I wheeled him in the wheelchair with his oxygen tank, and that went everywhere we went. And he came in and he said, I gotta say, I looked at your CT scans and your x-rays. I don't equate seeing what I see with someone who's alive.
Well, I asked him, I said, what's the prognosis for me? I was looking at my charts and everything. What can I expect? And this was a year ago. So where can I expect to be? Am I ever going to be back like I was? He goes, well, it's really hard to say because all the patients that I've had that have lungs that look like these aren't with us anymore. And so it's really hard to know where you're going to be.
It's hard, but incredibly humbling too, because we know that this,
It is a miracle.
To back up a little, when Mike, so it was a huge milestone when we finally got to the point where Mike was going to be transferred to a rehab facility.
Right. So I can no longer be, I don't need to be in ICU anymore because the boxes that need to be checked to be in ICU are no longer checked, even though I'm still very weak and still a long way to go. I didn't need life support anymore.
No, he's on dialysis still, so that was a big thing, and he was still on oxygen and all those things. So
you know what? One of the great things that I learned by going through all of this is when you go through these things, it opens up that whole empathy part of you, and I appreciate that. I'm thankful for that. So we went to this rehabilitation hospital.
So it was so exciting. This is supposed to be a big milestone. In fact, I remember as we left, they wheeled his bed out to the ambulance to transport him, and the floor of nurses, they were just lined with nurses and PTs and respiratory and clapping for him. And we were so excited to start this next chapter.
And unfortunately, this is where the story takes a turn for the worse. So the care that we received at this other hospital was subpar. Kari says that she would come to visit me and I would be out of it because of pain medication and anxiety medication, and there'd be vomit on me and on my gown and on my pillow, and I would be unattended. And it was a rough 30 days. I think it was about 30 days.
Yeah, and the goal was to get him off of oxygen and to get him off of dialysis.
And the feeding tube.
And
instead, they just gave me anxiety medication and pain medication and just sleep all the time. So I went way backwards. I don't feel comfortable dwelling on the negative part of the story. Maybe they did the best that they could, and we'll leave it at that. But Kari got very concerned and reached out to our friends at Freighter and explained the situation, and they became very concerned.
Well, this was kind of a cool part of the story, a huge miracle that happened, because I had been voicing some of my concerns where I was like, we're going backwards, I'm so frustrated because there was a day where I came there and I couldn't find anyone, and Mike was just laying there and he had thrown up all over himself. He was on a ventilator, and I just was trying to find someone. And then that night, it was a really bad night with my son. He was really struggling and he got really angry because he wanted to see Mike and couldn't understand why he couldn't. And we had to call the police. And this time they took him away to the Waukesha Mental Health Center. They'd also told me that because Mike wasn't showing progress and he was actually going backwards, that they were going to transfer him out to a facility in Illinois, because that was the only other one that would take him with being on a ventilator and dialysis. And I was so frustrated because I was like, they're not doing what they need to do for him. And now you're going to send him further away from us. And then that night, the police took my son away. And I just felt like I had a moment where I dropped to my knees and I was like, God, I'm at my lowest. And I remember pleading with him and saying, I don't know, I need something. Please, God, I need you to do something for me. So the next morning, I get a phone call, and our good friend, Jay Patel, who's a doctor at Freighter, had spoken with our other good friend, Tracy Zindel, who's also a doctor over at Freighter and goes to church with us. And he said to me, hey, Kari, because Mike was about to be sent out to Illinois. And he said, hey, listen, Tracy and I talked, and we need to get Mike back to Freighter. I was like, how though? He's technically not, he's not an ICU patient, but he's on dialysis and a ventilator. So he can't just be a patient there either. He said, just put the request in to have him transferred. And I was like, are you serious? And I just knew that was God saying, here you go. I put the request in that afternoon, and by that evening, that night, they had him at Freighter in the ICU, which technically he wasn't considered an ICU patient. But I can't even tell you, people were like, when people heard, they were also concerned. He's going back to the ICU. I'm like,
Why?
no, you don't understand.
Right.
It's the best day ever.
Right, but they were concerned even at the hospital. They're like, why are you coming back? You must be in really bad shape. I remember the respiratory therapist said, when I saw you back here, you look so bad, I didn't think you had long to live. And so it was good and bad because I can't stay there. I'm there now, but I can't stay there. So what are they going to do with me? In order for me to stay at Freighter, but get to a physical therapy floor, which is very strict. It's not just like it's inpatient therapy. I had to be off the ventilator, off of the feeding tube, and one other thing, right?
Yeah, and he had to be able to sit for 10 minutes.
So all of these things, like immediately, like I had a very short amount of time because I couldn't stay in the ICU, right?
So in the meantime, I come home that night and I'm trying to figure out what I need to do with my son. And a friend of mine, ours from church, Ben Mellor, calls me, and he had somehow, they weren't allowing any visitors. Like
at the Waukesha
mental health. Somehow
where our son was.
He went there and they let him in to see Brendan.
He said that he was driving and he felt strongly impressed that he should go see Brendan. And he knew that he couldn't.
Like I had tried and
he knew he couldn't get in. But he said, I just felt very strongly that I needed to go there. So he said he went there and he actually drove around back. And as he was getting out of his car, someone came out of a locked door. And he had a conversation with him and said, he said, I'm a minister from Brendan's church and I really need to see him. And he let him in.
There was 0 visitors allowed. They let him into Brendan's room to see him in there because Brendan was pretty scared to even come out and didn't even know how to communicate. And that's what's scary is it's basically like, if you think about like your 5 or 6-year-old child in a mental health facility. So the fact that Ben was able to not only get in the building, but get into his room and tell me, I saw your son. He's okay. And then he asked Brendan if he could give him a blessing and prayed with him. It was just such as a mom, such a source of comfort for me and such a cool experience. And then Ben had these really strong feelings as he was praying. And Ben said, can I come over and talk to you and the girls? I just need to share some stuff with you guys. And he came over and he prayed with us. And then he said, I hesitated first sharing this with you guys, but I couldn't not share it with you as I prayed. I felt the Spirit so strong. And I knew that God needed to share this with you.
He asked Kari if he could give her a blessing for me through her. In the blessing, he said that, and just to be clear, that we believe that the blessings for the laying on of hands are words inspired by the Holy Spirit from God to us as children. The blessing said that I would be restored to my normal health, that my kidneys would be restored to their normal function. In subsequent conversations with him, I asked him, I said, as you gave the blessing, what was your impression of that? What do those words mean? And he said, I felt that you'd be restored to exactly the way you were before.
And that was the words that he had said to the girls and I. And he said, part of me, it feels crazy. I've been going back and forth with this for days now because I felt like, how can I go to these people and tell them this? I don't want to give them false hope. But the more he prayed, the more God told him that he needed to come and tell me this. It really was incredible. So he was in the ICU, and over a couple days to a week, the progress was nothing short of a miracle.
Right. To me, it seemed like it was a couple days. So when I got there, within a day or two, my feeding tube, which needed to come out, it popped out. Like I woke up and I was all wet and I couldn't figure out what it was. The feeding tube had popped out. And then the next day, the respiratory therapist came in and he said, they told me that one of the things you need to do is get your trach out. You can't go into this next level without your trach. And I was like, oh, wow. So how does that process begin? He goes, it'll take about 5 seconds, and he pulled it out.
Mike was immediately able to start to breathe without it.
Right.
I mean, we were all like, how is this possible?
Yeah.
And they got him off the vent.
But I think within like 3 days, I was now a candidate to go onto this floor. So I went from being just a mess to within under a week being accepted to this floor for total rehab. And I went up to that floor, and all I had was nasal cannula oxygen. That's it. I had been taken off every other machine.
He had met the criteria miraculously, because if we didn't go here, we certainly weren't going to go back to this rehab unit, but it was like, where are we going to go? Because he was still on dialysis. He just wasn't showing enough kidney function to get off the dialysis. But they moved him down into this 5th floor rehab, and it was a 3-week program.
So I'd already been in the hospital for 5 months.
Yeah, and this was 3 intense weeks, and it was a schedule. Every day, though, it was just crazy, but it was Mike pushing himself like you wouldn't believe.
I think Kari mentioned before that someone had told her that my spirit would teach my body how to heal. And one of those things was manifested by a new thought that was actually a very pronounced thought in my head, that they would come in every morning and I would not be happy to see them. I wasn't excited to do all of the hard things. And a lot of times they'd give me a choice. They'd say, do you want to do this or you want to do this? And my brain would say, do the one that's over the quickest and is easiest. But I would make my mouth say, whichever one is harder. And I would always choose the harder one. I think that was one of the biggest things that helped me in my recovery to number one, not be afraid to do hard things. But number two, to achieve that hard thing and give me strength to do the next hard thing. And so I went from not being able to sit up to, in 3 weeks, I think it was week 2 that I took my first step. So July 9th, I finally left the hospital.
He was so worried about coming home because he's
and I was correct to be worried, because they didn't know. I knew that they didn't understand how much care I needed. They just wanted me home. They didn't care. But I knew that it was more than they thought. And they admitted later, like, yeah, that was a lot more than we thought it was going to be.
But it was still so good to have him home. And the day that he came home, it was so cool because the neighbor and some friends all arranged this welcome home parade. When our local news came, and just so many people were so excited, because this was an answer to their prayers too. So many people had invested in our family with all of their prayers, their time, their meals, their love. My gosh, like just being together. I would sit and look at Mike and have my whole family in a room together and just look up and thank God. I think so much of the journey wasn't even when he got out of the hospital, but coming home, was such a huge journey because our whole lives were different. And we were just so happy to have him home, but that didn't take away from the fact that everything was very different than when he left to go in 6 months before. And so it was challenging, but I kind of tried to handle it like I did when he was in the hospital. I knew that I was going to have to help him get up and out of bed and make him breakfast and help him shower and do his wound care. And I would set my alarm that much earlier to continue to try to do my scriptures, write in my journal or read or anything that I knew was going to give me, and pray and what I was going to give me that strength to get through that day.
But all of those pieces, all of those blessings, those miracles that we had along the way, all came together in the end and built this promise that we could depend on. The blessing for me that Kari received was one of the biggest things, if not the biggest thing that I drew from. There were so many times I went into the hospital January 28th, not feeling so good and having COVID. I was a big, strong guy with a job where I work outside quite a bit and very physical, and woke up 70 pounds lighter with no muscle. I mean, I just completely shrunk, skin hanging off of my bones, and that need help in doing everything. And I'm embarrassed to admit that I would just sob sometimes and say, I miss my old body. I miss what I used to be. I think that's healthy now that it's let that grief come out, that loss, because I did lose something. But then I would very quickly turn my attitude towards getting better. And it is so wonderful that we have the spiritual mechanisms that can comfort us and give us peace when that anxiety comes, when that fear comes, that our Father in heaven has given us the tools that we need to battle against that and remember who we are, remember that we're strong, remember that we have so many eternal promises and that we have divine destination that we're traveling towards. And this sounds weird, but I hope that it comes across what I'm trying to say. I miss needing my Father in heaven so much. And the reason that feels so odd to say is because it only made it obvious when I was dying how much I needed him. I still need him just as much, but because I'm human and there's no life-threatening thing happening to me, I miss it. I still feel it. And so I try every day to pray in a way and communicate with my Father in heaven and express those feelings that I have, the gratitude that I have, that I'm still here on earth with my family, that I can go through this earthly existence with them and help them in any way that I can. I'm so grateful for that. I'm thankful for what I went through, for what I learned, and what we're still going through, and as a family. And so I'm trying every day right now to live in a way that shows my gratitude. So the final miracle, right, Kari?
Yeah.
The doctor told me that I have less than a 2% chance of getting off dialysis after I've been on it for a year. So after I was on it for a year, I got off dialysis. So I've been off of dialysis now for 3.5 months, 4 months. That was a huge miracle.
Getting off of it, but like it's, so he's functioning. One kidney is not
Functioning at all,
and the other kidney is functioning at only 13%. So he's still in end stage renal failure. It's scary.
I'm on the list for a transplant. I need a transplant. The doctor said that if my kidney function improves to 20% by Christmas, that I can get off of the list. I'm believing that the blessing that I received is that my kidneys will be restored to their function, their normal function, and that I will not need a kidney transplant. And I believe that.
I know now that whatever comes our way, we're going to be okay.
Yeah. Well, your story is truly miraculous. Like you are a living miracle. It sounds like you beat all odds with God's help. The thought that came to me as you were talking about your kidneys and being restored, apply that blessing of have your spirit teach you. So do you ask, like, Spirit, what do I need to do to restore my kidneys? Show me.
Yeah, I pray all the time for wisdom, inspiration on new things that I might be able to try or do. I follow all of my doctors. What I try and do is communicate with my body in a way to tell my body that I love it. Thank you so much for functioning the way that you're functioning, and that I have faith that you can do even better, that I need you. I need my kidneys. I need you guys. And thank you for what you're doing. I try and picture them in my body. I also try and picture Christ standing in front of me with his hands on me or on my kidneys, healing them.
Yeah.
And it's been a miracle, that Mike is for months now has been able to stay off of dialysis. Gosh, like I can't even tell you how great it's been life-changing for him to get off dialysis.
Well, I so appreciate you sharing your story with me. I loved all the details, all the heartfelt. You could feel how trying this was in your life, and how I love that you said you felt so connected at that time to God and to the Spirit, and you knew he was helping. And I think that's oftentimes those challenges give us those insights that God is very present in our lives. And even though we might not feel him as close as you did then, he still is very present. And I think we just know that more when we're struggling.
Yes.
We recognize it more.
Yes.
But I really do love your story. It truly is miraculous. And I believe that you're going to still continue to just recover completely and get through all of this. So both of you are strong. You are an amazing team. It was fun to watch how you just look at each other and knew whose turn it was. And I can tell you work very well together. And I love that.
I'm just so glad we get to keep living each day together.
Yes.
That's the best part right there.
One other thing that I've learned is that it's not about being happy without a struggle. It's about being happy within the struggle, because the reason that we're here is to struggle. and to learn through those
Yeah.
struggles. So if we can find a way to be happy and hopeful, even while we're struggling, because we all struggle, then we've succeeded.
Amen. I love that. I tell people that I coach all the time, it's called growing pains. And we came to grow. And
That's right.
sometimes it is hard, but we
Yeah.
wanted it. We do love, we're happiest when we're growing. And I really believe that too. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liza. It's great.
We love talking with you.
Thank you so much for listening to this miracle story. Please subscribe to my channel if you liked it. You can also find me on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify. And remember to notice and celebrate miracles everywhere, because the more miracles we notice, the more miracles happen.